guys, it's Miss Glass. We are going to continue with our history. We're on page 235 today, so go ahead and get out those history books and highlighters or Flair pen, you know. And we are going to continue talking about Harriet Tubman, who was not born Harriet Tubman, was she? What was her name? Araminta, and her parents called her Minty, but she decides to change it later to Harriet, which was also her mother's name. Now, Harriet was born into slavery in Massachusetts. She was never brought over from a different country. She was born into this, so she never knew another way of life, but she did know that there was freedom in other parts of the country. And she actually marries a man who's very different than she is. How is he different? How is John Tubman different from Harriet? Sorry, I got a text and looked at it. That's right, he was a freed slave. So that means he still worked and did like very tough chores probably, but he made money, unlike Harriet. Harriet doesn't get paid for her work. But yesterday we talked about how Harriet escaped. Remember, she had a Quaker woman that was a friend, and she helped her find the Underground Railroad, which we found out is not an actual railroad, is it? It was a series of houses set up to help slaves find freedom. So Harriet went on the Underground Railroad, and she made it all the way to what state? Pennsylvania. She gets to Pennsylvania and she gains her freedom and begins working in a hotel. Okay, so today we are on page 235 once again, and I want you to put a tracking finger on the subheading that says helping others, and let's read. Helping others. Other groups of people arrived by way of the Underground Railroad. One group told Harriet Tubman that her sister, along with her children, were being sold to another man who lived far away. She knew what she needed to do. She would go back to Maryland, get her sister and children, and bring them to Pennsylvania. Okay, I want you to highlight that. She would go back to Maryland, get her sister and children, and bring them to Pennsylvania. Okay, so Harriet finds out that her sister is being sold to someone else, and Harriet's not going to be able to keep up with her as well like that. She's not going to know what's going on, and she could be sold to someone who's very, very cruel. So Harriet decides to go get her sister and those children. Now, this is very dangerous for Harriet, because if she is caught, guys, she will probably be put to death. She'll definitely be sent back to her master. Okay, so let's keep reading, second paragraph. The trip was dangerous, just like we talked about. If Harriet Tubman was caught, she would be a slave again. But she was very careful. She asked God to help her on her journey, and he did. She brought her sister and her children to freedom. Her faith in God gave her the courage to make this trip many more times. And I want you to highlight this next part. She was even able to take her parents on the Underground Railroad. Okay, let's highlight that. She was even able to take her parents on the Underground Railroad. Because they were old and feeble, Mrs. Tubman made a cart that they could ride on during the long trip. Okay, so Harriet, we know when she was going on the Underground Railroad, she needed to stay like walking through the water, you know, to get the people off their trail as much as possible. She can't do that when she has her parents, right? They're in that cart because they're older, but she wants them to have freedom too. So they are on a cart. This makes it even more dangerous. They've got to stay like closer to the road even. They're not going to be able to cut through the woods as easily. So all of this is very dangerous. Let's keep going. I keep getting emails, guys. Sorry. Because some slave owners offered rewards for their runaway slaves, Harriet Tubman often dressed as an old man or woman to hide who she was. Once, at a train station, two men thought they recognized her. She grabbed a book and pretended to read it. Since the slave would not have been able to read, the men went on. Mrs. Tubman was quick thinking saved her from being caught. Isn't that smart? It's very smart of her. It's not very smart of them, right? Like, Harriet's not dumb. She knows that a slave's not supposed to be able to read. But it's wonderful that she did not get caught. But let's keep going. Since so many slaves were finding their freedom, a new law was passed that said anyone, including people in the North, who saw a runaway slave would have to turn them in or go to jail. Now, to be truly free, a slave would have to go all the way to Canada. Okay, remember, that's the country above the United States. So instead of just having to make it to Pennsylvania, now you've got to get all the way into Canada, because if they catch you in Pennsylvania, they have to turn you in or they go to jail as well. Still, Mrs. Tubman was determined to help as many people as she could. Harriet Tubman helped many people find their freedom from slavery. She once said, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." She never had anyone caught, guys. How amazing is that? Very few others could say the same. Let's look at the next subheading, Civil War, on page 236. Soon, the North and South were at war. What war is this, guys? The Civil War. When Mrs. Tubman was asked to help the Northern Army, she was happy to serve. And I want you to highlight this next part. She helped take care of wounded soldiers, and she gathered herbs and plants to make medicines just as her mother had taught her. Once again, highlight. She helped take care of wounded soldiers, and she gathered herbs and plants to make medicines just as her mother taught her. And this next sentence I'd also like you to highlight. Harriet Tubman's most exciting job in the war was being a scout and a spy. She was a spy, guys. How cool is that? So her most exciting job was being a scout and a spy in the war. She could sneak past the enemy and get information from slaves who wanted to help the North. No one thought of a small woman as a spy. And highlight this part. Mrs. Tubman became the commander of intelligence operations for the Northern Army. She told other spies and scouts how to get past the enemy and gather important information. One more time. Mrs. Tubman became the commander of intelligence operations for the Northern Army. She told other spies and scouts how to get past the enemy and gather important information. Guys, she became a commander and a part of the army. That is so cool. So neat. She was a slave. She found her freedom. She becomes a conductor of the Underground Railroad. She starts taking care of wounded soldiers, like nursing them back to health. Then she becomes a spy, and then she becomes a commander of intelligence. Whoa, that is some type of resume, right? Next part, freedom for all. Let's read together. In 1863, and I want you to highlight, President Abraham Lincoln signed a very important document called the Emancipation Proclamation. Say that word. Emancipation Proclamation. Let's do it one more time. The Emancipation Proclamation. And let's keep highlighting. It said that all slaves in the southern states should be free. So it has a big fancy name, Emancipation Proclamation. But all it said was that all the slaves should be free. When the war ended, the North had won. Finally, in 1865, Congress made slavery in the United States illegal. or against the law. So it took 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation to outlaw slavery. Harriet Tubman's dream of seeing slavery end had come true, as she lived to see the end of slavery. Next subheading, more work to do. Life after the war was still hard for the many people who had been slaves. Jobs were hard to find. So even though they've gotten their freedom, they're having a really difficult time finding jobs, because the appeal of the slaves at the time was that it was free labor. And then you have the Civil War, and during the Civil War, the Northern soldiers, they come down and they burned a lot of the crops, and they took over a lot of those plantations and things. So now the people who had the plantations in the South that needed the slaves are no longer functioning. So the slaves can't work there because that plantation's not up and running. They don't have anything to do in the fields, so you could get paid. So they might move somewhere else, but there's only so many jobs to be had. So it really was a tough time for many of these now free slaves. But I want you to highlight this. What did Harriet do? Because you know Harriet's going to do something. Harriet Tubman opened her home to former slaves. Once again, Harriet Tubman opened her home to former slaves. She was going to help them no matter what. She spent her money to purchase what they needed and help them find jobs and places to live. One day, a lady named Sarah Bradford came to see Harriet Tubman. "Tell me your story," she said. "I will write it down for you in a book. You can sell the book and use the money to help people." Mrs. Bradford wrote 2 books about Mrs. Tubman. One book was Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people. Mrs. Tubman used the money to continue helping anyone she could. Harriet Tubman lived until she was about 93 years old. So that was very old at this time. Okay, healthcare is not the same as it was. So 93, that's awesome. God used her as he used Moses to lead many people out of slavery. Today in Auburn, New York, where she lived, a plaque on the courthouse honors her extraordinary life, courage, and determination. And there's a picture of that plaque in your book. If you don't have your book, there's a picture of that plaque. Now, it is not in Auburn, Alabama. It is in a different Auburn in New York. So in Auburn, New York, there is a plaque in her memory. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you got everything highlighted.